I gave him 7 years of my life. I built his pack, managed his lands, and loved him unconditionally. His thanks? A public slap across the face just to make his new mistress smile. He thought breaking my heart would break my spirit. He was wrong. Because the most dangerous man in the room wasn't the boy who struck me, it was the rival alpha watching from the shadows, waiting to offer me a real crown. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The crack of Ethan's palm against my cheek echoed through the great stone hall. The sound was sharp, brittle, and sudden. For a second, the roaring hearth fire seemed to freeze. My head snapped to the side, my loose hair blinding my vision. The iron tang of blood bloomed against my tongue. Silence fell over the 300 members of the Crestwood pack. No one breathed. No one moved. I did not fall. I kept my feet planted on the stone floor, though the heat in my left cheek burned like liquid fire. Slowly, I turned my face back to look at the man I had loved for 7 years. Ethan stood before me, his chest heaving under his heavy leather armor. His knuckles were white, trembling slightly from the force of the strike. But there was no regret in his eyes. There was only a desperate, volatile hunger to prove himself. He looked past me, his gaze landing on the woman standing just behind his right shoulder. Blair. She was the daughter of the Southern Alliance leader, draped in pristine white silks that looked ridiculous in our brutal northern winter. Blair gasped, covering her mouth with her manicured hands, pretending to be horrified. But I saw the wicked gleam of triumph in her eyes. She wanted my position, my title, and my man. And tonight, Ethan was giving them to her on a silver platter. You will hand over the emerald of the First Mother, Vivian, Ethan said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling growl meant to command obedience. It belongs to the true lady of this house now. The great hall remained dead silent. My mother had passed that emerald to me on her deathbed. It was not a piece of pack property, it was my blood right. Ethan knew this. He knew it when he whispered promises of forever into my ear last winter. He knew it when he swore to protect my honor above all else. But those promises had vanished the moment Blair's father offered Ethan 50 fresh hunting horses and an alliance that would double his territory. To Ethan, I was suddenly nothing more than an inconvenient orphan of an old era. I asked you a question, Vivian, Ethan barked, stepping closer, trying to use his physical presence to break my spirit. The pack members watched from the long wooden tables, their faces blurred by the torchlight. Some looked away in shame. Others looked at me with cold indifference. In their world, strength was everything, and I was currently the one being crushed. I looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and felt the final, fragile thread of my affection snap cleanly in half. The man I loved would have died before letting another person humiliate me. The creature standing before me was a stranger, blinded by ambition and weak enough to strike a woman to impress a new guest. I did not cry. I refused to give Blair the satisfaction of seeing a single tear. Instead, I raised my chin, ignoring the throbbing ache in my jaw. The emerald stays with me, I said, my voice steady, clear, and perfectly audible to every ear in the room. Ethan's eyes narrowed into slits of pure fury. You defy your alpha, he hissed, reaching out to grab my arm. You are no longer my alpha, I said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the room like a silver blade. Before he could touch me, I reached up to my leather collar and unhooked the silver crestwood medallion. The piece of metal had been heavy against my collarbone for years, a symbol of my devotion to his people. I dropped it. It hit the stone floor with a dull, hollow clink, rolling until it stopped right at Ethan's boots. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. To reject the pack medallion was an act of exile. "Vivian, do not play games with me," Ethan warned, his face flushing crimson with public embarrassment. "You have nowhere to go. You have no family left." "She doesn't need your family, Ethan." A deep, gravelly voice cut through the tension from the darkest corner of the hall. Everyone turned. Sitting at the far table, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed guards, was Tristan. Tristan was the sovereign of the Midnight Ridge, Ethan's oldest and most ruthless rival. He was only here because of the ancient winter solstice truce, a mandatory treaty that forbade bloodshed for 3 nights. He had sat in total silence all evening, drinking his dark ale, watching the drama unfold with bored eyes. Until now. Tristan stood up. He was taller than Ethan, his shoulders broader, his body bearing the scars of 100 survived battles. He wore a dark, midnight blue woolen tunic and a massive coat of black bear fur. His eyes were a piercing, calculated grey. He walked past the long tables, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the stone. The Crestwood guards instinctively put their hands on their sword hilts, but Tristan didn't even glance at them. His focus was entirely on me. I didn't turn back toward Ethan. I didn't look at Blair's pale, suddenly nervous face. I walked straight toward Tristan. With every step I took away from Ethan, the air in my lungs felt lighter, cleaner. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of the rival leader. "They say the Midnight Ridge honors those who possess true resilience," I said, looking directly into Tristan's cold grey eyes. "They say you value those who do not break." Tristan looked down at my bruised cheek. A dangerous, quiet storm flickered in his expression, his jaw tightening into a hard line. "We do," Tristan murmured, his voice rich and steady. "My allegiance is vacant," I said, loud enough for Ethan to hear. "And my loyalty is absolute to those who earn it." Behind me, I heard Ethan roar in fury. "Vivian! Step away from him. You are a daughter of Crestwood, you cannot sell yourself to a savage." Tristan ignored Ethan completely. Instead, he reached up and unclasped his massive, heavy black bear fur coat. With a movement that was surprisingly gentle for a man of his size, he draped the warm, heavy fur over my shivering shoulders. The scent of pine, winter rain, and pure, intoxicating power enveloped me. It was the first time in months I felt safe. "You are no longer a daughter of Crestwood," Tristan said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He extended his large, calloused hand toward me. "You are with me now." I placed my hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, and unyielding. Tristan turned his head slightly, casting a devastating, contemptuous glance back at Ethan. "Thank you for the hospitality, chieftain," Tristan said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But it seems you don't know how to keep what is valuable." Without waiting for a reply, Tristan turned and led me out of the great hall, his guards falling into formation around us. I did not look back once. Behind us, the sound of Ethan smashing a wooden table in blind rage followed us out into the cold, silent night. The wind outside the fortress howled like a wounded beast, driving sheets of white snow against the iron-rimmed carriage. Inside, the silence was thick, heavy, and charged with an unspoken tension. I sat wrapped in Tristan's massive bear fur coat, the warmth of it slowly seeping into my frozen bones. Across from me sat the sovereign himself. He didn't speak a word as the carriage climbed the steep, rocky paths toward the Midnight Ridge. He simply watched me through the dim light of a single lantern, his grey eyes calculating and unreadable. My cheek throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a constant reminder of Ethan's betrayal. But beneath the physical pain, a strange, crystalline clarity had taken root in my mind. I was no longer the discarded fiancé of a weak man. I was a wild card in a dangerous political game. By the time the carriage crossed the heavy iron gates of the Midnight Ridge fortress, the storm had reached its peak. This place was different from the Crestwood lands, where Ethan's home was built on wooden grandiosity and fragile alliances. Tristan's fortress was carved directly into the black stone of the mountain. It looked eternal, immovable, and terrifyingly secure. Tristan stepped out into the snow first, extending his hand to help me down. His grip was as steady as it had been in the Great Hall, unaffected by the freezing wind. He guided me through the massive stone corridors, where armored guards bowed their heads in deep, genuine respect as we passed. There was no whispering here, no snickering, no judgment. He led me into a private chamber that was already warmed by a roaring fire. A large bed with thick, dark blankets sat in the center, and a basin of steaming water stood on a nearby table. "Rest here," Tristan said, his voice cutting through the quiet room. "A healer will be here shortly to tend to your face." He turned to leave, his long coat sweeping behind him, but I spoke before he could reach the door. "Why did you do it, Tristan?" I asked, stepping out of the heavy fur coat and letting it rest on a chair. He stopped, his back to me for a brief second before he slowly turned around. "Do what, Vivian?" "Take me in," I said, crossing my arms to hide the slight tremble in my fingers. "You risked breaking the solstice truce. You publicly humiliated a rival chieftain in his own hall. All for a woman you barely know." Tristan walked back toward me, his heavy steps deliberate. He stopped just a few inches away, looking down at me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "I have watched Ethan for years," Tristan said quietly. "He is a boy playing at being a king. He thinks leadership is about hoarding gold and taking what he wants by force." He raised a hand, his thumb gently brushing the skin just below my bruised cheek, careful not to touch the swollen flesh. "But true strength is knowing the value of loyalty. You gave him 7 years of your life, Vivian. You kept his people fed during the Great Frost. You managed his borders while he fought useless skirmishes." My eyes widened slightly. I hadn't realized anyone outside of Crestwood knew of my work. "Ethan thought he was discarding an orphan," Tristan continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low pitch. "But he actually threw away the brain of his entire operation. I didn't take you in out of pity, Vivian. I took you in because a woman with your mind and your fire is worth more than 100 of Ethan's soldiers." A rush of emotion, hot and fierce, surged through my chest. For months, Ethan had made me feel small, telling me that my advice was useless, that my place was simply to look beautiful and stay silent. But Tristan saw me. He actually saw me. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tristan's lips curved into a slow, dark smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I want exactly what you want, Vivian. I want to see him lose everything." He stepped back, giving me space. "The Winter Solstice Festival continues tomorrow at the Neutral Trading Grounds. Ethan will be there with his new prize, Blair, trying to secure the southern trade routes." I understood his meaning instantly. My mind, sharp and analytical, began to map out the possibilities. "He thinks he has the upper hand because Blair's father controls the southern rivers," I said, a cold smile touching my own lips. "But he forgets that the southern rivers are useless if the northern mountain passes are blocked. And I know the exact patrol schedules and supply routes for the Crestwood passes." Tristan's smile widened, a gleam of genuine satisfaction in his grey eyes. "Tomorrow, we walk into that trading council together," Tristan said. "You will wear my colors, you will sit by my side, and we will strip Ethan of every bit of power he thinks he bought with that slap." The door opened, and an elderly healer rushed in with a basket of herbs, bowing deeply to Tristan. Tristan nodded to her, then looked back at me one last time. "Get some sleep, Vivian. Tomorrow, the hunt begins." As the healer began to apply a cooling salve to my face, I looked into the fire, the remaining warmth of Ethan's memory burning away into ash. He thought he had broken me in front of his pack. But he had only driven me into the arms of the one man who could destroy him completely. The neutral trading grounds were a spectacle of color and noise, a stark contrast to the barren white wilderness that surrounded them. Massive silk tents of red, gold, and blue lined the frozen valley, representing the various clans of the northern and southern territories. Despite the bitter cold, the air smelled of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the underlying scent of political ambition. Inside the central pavilion, the atmosphere was stifling. Ethan sat at the head of the long oak table, dressed in his finest ceremonial armor. Blair sat beside him, dripping in gold chains and flashing a vibrant emerald ring on her finger, the very ring Ethan had tried to steal from me. He was speaking loudly, laughing with the southern merchants, clearly enjoying his newfound status as the wealthiest chieftain in the region. Then, the heavy velvet curtains of the pavilion were pulled back. The laughter died instantly. Tristan stepped into the light first, his imposing figure commanding immediate silence. But it was not Tristan who held everyone's breathless attention. It was me. I wore a gown of deep midnight blue velvet that flowed around my ankles like liquid shadow. The neckline was high and elegant, accentuating the sharp line of my collarbone, and around my neck hung my mother's emerald, glowing fiercely against the dark fabric. My hair was woven with silver threads, and my skin was flawless, the healer's salve having erased every trace of Ethan's strike. I looked young, breathtakingly beautiful, and entirely untouchable. I saw Ethan's goblet freeze halfway to his mouth. His eyes went wide, his face turning a dangerous shade of pale as he stared at me. Beside him, Blair's smug smile withered into a look of pure, venomous jealousy. Tristan offered me his arm, and I placed my hand upon it, walking with a slow, regal grace to the two vacant chairs at the center of the council table. "You look out of place, Vivian," Ethan muttered, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and wounded pride as we took our seats. "This is a council of rulers. Not a place for runaway orphans." Tristan didn't even look up as he poured himself a glass of wine. "She is not a guest, Ethan," Tristan said smoothly. "She is my primary advisor. And her voice carries the weight of the midnight ridge." A murmur of shock went through the assembled lords. Ethan slammed his fist onto the table. "She knows nothing. If you think you can use her to intimidate me, you are mistaken. The Southern Alliance has granted Crestwood exclusive rights to the river trades. We control the flow of grain for the winter. If you want to survive the frost, you will bow to my prices." The Southern merchants nodded in agreement, looking smug. Ethan thought he had won. He thought he had trapped the North. I leaned forward, placing my hands elegantly on the table. "The Southern rivers are indeed impressive, Chieftain Ethan," I said, my voice cutting through the room like ice. "But you seem to forget that rivers freeze. By the second week of the deep frost, your boats will be trapped in ice 3 feet thick." Ethan scoffed. "We have the mountain passes to transport the goods by sled. Crestwood controls the Eastern Pass." "The Eastern Pass," I repeated, a cold, mocking smile touching my lips. "The very pass that suffers from severe structural weakness near the upper ridge? The one where a single heavy snowstorm triggers an avalanche that blocks the path for 2 months?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "How do you?" "I managed your ledger for 7 years, Ethan," I interrupted, my voice rising so that every lord in the room could hear. "I know that the Eastern Pass hasn't been fortified since your father's time. I know that your guards are currently undersupplied and freezing at the checkpoints. And I know that if the merchants trust your word, their goods will be buried under 20 feet of snow before the solstice ends." The Southern merchants instantly turned to look at Ethan, their faces filled with sudden alarm and suspicion. "Is this true?" one of the older Southern lords demanded, glaring at Ethan. "You guaranteed the safety of our cargo." Ethan panicked, his face flushing crimson as he looked around the room. She's lying. She's just a bitter woman trying to seek revenge because I replaced her. She doesn't lie, Tristan's voice boomed, silencing the entire room. He stood up, looking down at Ethan with absolute dominance. And while Crestwood offers you frozen rivers and deadly avalanches, the Midnight Ridge offers a solution. Tristan gestured to a map on the wall. We have cleared the Western Mountain Pass. It is wider, heavily fortified, and completely safe from winter storms. Starting today, any merchant who aligns with the Midnight Ridge will have free, protected passage through our lands. He looked down at me, his expression softening with genuine pride. And this agreement was designed entirely by Vivian. The room erupted into shouts of approval. The southern merchants immediately scrambled to get away from Ethan's table, rushing toward Tristan's guards to sign the new trade treaties. Within minutes, Ethan's Grand Alliance was completely dismantled. He sat entirely alone, bankrupt and powerless. Blair looked around in horror, realizing that her golden future had just turned to ash. She turned on Ethan, her voice shrill. You idiot! You said you had everything under control. Ethan didn't hear her. He was staring at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic regret. He took a step toward me, his hands shaking. Vivian, please. We can talk about this. Come back to Crestwood. I can make things right. You can have your place back. I stood up, adjusting the heavy midnight blue coat around my shoulders. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pain, just pity. You had my loyalty, Ethan, I said quietly. But you traded it for a shadow. Now, you can watch from the cold while I build an empire. Tristan stepped up beside me, his large hand resting protectively on the small of my back. Together, we walked out of the pavilion and into the bright winter sun, leaving the broken chieftain behind in the dark. The iron gates of the Midnight Ridge fortress closed behind us with a heavy and definitive thud. The sound felt like a massive lock turning on my miserable past. Ethan's pathetic pleas at the trading grounds were already fading from my memory like smoke. I stood in the central courtyard as the biting winter wind whipped my midnight blue cloak around my ankles. I fully expected Tristan to politely escort me back to the isolated guest chambers. Instead, his large hand found the small of my back to guide me toward the towering main keep. You are not a guest anymore, Vivian, he said over the howling wind. You are the architect of our new dawn. We entered the great command hall without any hesitation. It was a massive stone room dominated by a brilliantly carved obsidian map table. Dozens of heavily scarred generals and seasoned pack warriors stood around the perimeter. The moment Tristan stepped through the stone archway, every single one of them dropped to one knee. It was not a forced bow of fear, but a raw display of absolute respect. Tristan did not even look at his kneeling soldiers. His intense grey eyes were focused entirely on me. Rise, he commanded while pulling out a heavy oak chair at the very head of the table. He did not sit in the chair himself. He gestured gracefully for me to take the seat of the sovereign. A sudden and suffocating silence fell over the battle-hardened warriors. I hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping forward. I sat down, feeling the warm leather beneath me. The position offered a commanding and absolute view of the entire war room. Tristan stepped right behind my chair and placed both of his massive hands on my shoulders. His sudden touch sent a strange electric jolt straight down my spine. It was a visceral sensation I had never felt in all my 7 years with Ethan. My inner wolf suddenly stirred with a fierce and possessive awakening. The intoxicating scent of pine and winter rain enveloped my senses completely. Tell them what you saw on the Eastern Pass, Tristan ordered quietly against my ear. I looked at the dark and expectant faces of the Midnight Ridge elite. I took a deep breath and let the icy analytical part of my mind take full control. Ethan's supply lines are built on pure arrogance and rotting wood, I began clearly. My voice rang out perfectly against the solid stone walls. I detailed the exact vulnerabilities of the Crestwood defenses without holding anything back. I exposed every fatal flaw I had begged Ethan to fix for years. I explained the terrain blind spots and the starving guard rotations. The generals listened with undeniable and rapt attention. Their respect visibly grew with every single tactical truth I revealed. I was no longer a silent trophy meant to look pretty beside a weak man. I was a lethal weapon, and Tristan had just proudly unsheathed me. If we march a battalion through the lower valley tonight, we sever his final access route, I concluded. One of the oldest generals slammed his clenched fist against his chest in a formal salute. The lady possesses the brilliant mind of a true predator, the old warrior grunted. Tristan's grip on my shoulders tightened slightly in proud acknowledgement. She possesses the mind of my equal, Tristan corrected him loudly. The word equal hung in the heavy air with profound meaning. In the brutal northern territories, an alpha did not have equals unless they were bound by the soul. The strategic meeting eventually dispersed efficiently. It left Tristan and me completely alone in the dimly lit hall. The flickering wall torches cast long dancing shadows across the obsidian map. I stood up and turned around to face him directly. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. You give me too much power too quickly, I whispered into the quiet room. Your pack will definitely question your judgment if you elevate an outsider so fast. Tristan stepped closer to erase the remaining physical distance between us. He reached out and let his rough knuckles gently graze my unblemished cheek. You were never an outsider, Vivian, he murmured deeply. His intense gaze dropped briefly to my slightly parted lips. You were simply trapped in the wrong territory for years. He leaned his face in, and I completely refused to pull away. The immense heat radiating from his massive frame chased away my last lingering chills. My wolf recognized you the exact moment you dropped that pathetic collar, Tristan confessed. His voice turned into a low and possessive rumbling purr. The unexpected revelation hit me like a powerful physical blow. The true mate bond. It was the ancient and undeniable calling that I thought was just a bedtime myth. Ethan had blindly claimed me through politics and duty, but Tristan's very soul was desperately reaching out to claim mine. I closed my eyes gracefully as he pressed his warm forehead against mine. Then claim what is rightfully yours, I breathed out softly. I surrendered completely to the intoxicating and inevitable pull of our shared destiny. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the hall burst open with a violent crash. A young scout covered in fresh snow dropped heavily to his knees. My sovereign, the scout gasped out with wide, urgent eyes. Ethan has completely lost his mind. Tristan stepped back as his romantic demeanor vanished in a split second. The deeply lethal alpha instantly returned to his eyes. Speak clearly, Tristan commanded with ice in his tone. He has rallied a rogue mercenary faction from the eastern wastelands, the scout reported rapidly. He intends to attack the fortress tonight to drag the lady back by force. I did not flinch at the terrifying news. Instead, a cold and ruthless smile slowly spread across my face. Let him come and meet his absolute end. The piercing blast of the war horn shattered the fragile midnight silence. It was a harsh and desperate sound echoing aggressively from the lower valley. I stood perfectly still in the command hall without a single trace of fear in my blood. Tristan slowly withdrew his warm hand from my cheek. The romantic heat in his piercing grey eyes instantly froze into glacial ice. He was no longer just the man whose soul had reached out to mine. He was the sovereign of the Midnight Ridge preparing for an absolute slaughter. Stay here where it is safe, Tristan commanded in a low and dangerous rumble. I shook my head and stepped purposefully toward the heavy oak doors. An alpha does not hide his mate when the wolves come to bite, I answered smoothly. A dark and thrilling smirk touched the corner of his lips. He reached out and draped my heavy midnight blue fur cloak over my shoulders. The intoxicating scent of pine and winter rain grounded my surging adrenaline. Together, we walked out of the keep and onto the towering black stone battlements. The freezing wind whipped my hair into a wild halo around my face. Below us, the eastern snowfields were stained with the chaotic glow of hundreds of torches. Ethan had brought a ragged army of rogue mercenaries from the frozen wastelands. They were a disorganized mass of desperate killers driven only by the promise of gold. They lacked the absolute discipline of a true northern pack. I looked down at the pathetic display of force with total analytical detachment. He brought them through the Weeping Gorge, I observed quietly. Exactly as you predicted, Tristan confirmed while resting his hands on the frozen stone parapet. Ethan rode at the front of the mercenary horde on a massive black warhorse. He wore his ceremonial silver armor, which gleamed foolishly under the moonlight. He looked like a desperate boy playing dress-up in a king's bloody theater. Tristan! Ethan roared furiously, his voice carrying over the wind. Send Vivian down right now, and I will let your people live. A chilling wave of laughter rippled through the elite Midnight Ridge archers lining the walls. They found the arrogant threat genuinely hilarious. Tristan did not yell back. He simply raised his right hand in a slow and deliberate motion. The massive iron gates of the fortress did not stay shut to hide us. They groaned loudly and swung wide open to invite the slaughter. Ethan's eyes widened in brief confusion before his misplaced arrogance took over. He spurred his horse forward, leading the screaming mercenaries straight into the courtyard. He thought he had caught the Midnight Ridge unprepared. He was tragically and completely wrong. The moment the last mercenary crossed the threshold, the heavy iron portcullis slammed shut behind them. They were instantly trapped in the sprawling killbox of the lower courtyard. Tristan finally stepped up to the edge of the parapet to be fully seen. He did not need to shout to command the absolute attention of the trapped army. His suffocating alpha aura rolled over the courtyard like a physical shockwave of pure dread. Several of the weaker mercenaries immediately dropped to their knees in sheer terror. Ethan struggled wildly to keep his panicked horse under control. You are trespassing on sovereign ground, little boy, Tristan's voice echoed off the black stone walls. I came for what belongs to me. Ethan screamed, pointing a trembling sword up at the balcony. I stepped out of the shadows and stood shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful man in the north. The torches below illuminated my face perfectly for Ethan to see. I was not a captive, and I was definitely not a victim. I was wearing the colors of his greatest enemy with devastating pride. Nothing here belongs to you, Ethan, I said, my voice cutting through the courtyard like a silver blade. You threw your diamond in the mud to pick up a worthless shiny stone. Kill them. Ethan shrieked, his face twisting into a mask of complete madness. Burn the keep and bring her to me. Tristan let out a dark, booming laugh that rattled the very bones of the mercenaries. He lowered his hand. From the shadows of the upper parapets, 1,000 black-fletched arrows rained down simultaneously. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The screaming was deafening as the mercenary front line collapsed in a bloody heap. They tried to turn back, but the iron portcullis blocked their only desperate escape route. Tristan's elite vanguard poured out from the side armories like a tide of blue and black steel. They moved with terrifying precision, cutting down the invaders without breaking a single sweat. I watched the violence unfold with a totally numb and calculated calm. This was the brutal reality of the world Ethan thought he could conquer with cheap tricks. Within less than 10 minutes, the entire mercenary force was either dead or violently disarmed. Ethan's majestic black warhorse had been shot out from under him. He was now kneeling in the blood-stained snow, completely surrounded by Tristan's hulking guards. His silver armor was dented, covered in mud, and completely stripped of its false glory. Tristan turned to me, offering his large arm with perfect gentlemanly grace. "Shall we greet our uninvited guest?" he asked smoothly. I placed my hand in his, feeling the electric pulse of our mate bond thrumming between us. "We absolutely shall," I replied. We walked slowly down the grand stone staircase toward the courtyard. The heavy oak doors opened to reveal the chilling aftermath of the massacre. The Midnight Ridge warriors parted instantly to make a wide path for us. They lowered their heads respectfully as their sovereign and his chosen mate walked past. We stopped exactly 3 feet in front of the broken and kneeling chieftain of Crestwood. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic mixture of terror and disbelief. "Vivian, please," Ethan gasped out, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. I looked down at the man who had struck me for another woman's amusement. I felt absolutely nothing but cold and distant disgust. "You should have stayed in the south, Ethan," I whispered softly. The air in the subterranean holding cells of the Midnight Ridge was thick with the scent of damp stone and absolute despair. Ethan hung by his wrists from heavy iron chains forged in the dark fires of the northern mountains. His expensive ceremonial silver armor had been violently stripped away, leaving him shivering in torn and blooded linen. The pale moonlight from the narrow grated window above cast long, pathetic shadows across his deeply bruised face. He was no longer the arrogant alpha of the Crestwood pack who had struck me so boldly in the great stone hall. He was a broken trespasser waiting for a brutal judgment he could not fight. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the spiraling stone staircase, signaling our long-awaited arrival. The massive iron door of his cell screeched open, protesting aggressively against the freezing moisture. Tristan stepped into the dim light first, his towering frame instantly consuming the claustrophobic space. His deep midnight blue heavy cloak brushed the dirty floor with an aura of terrifying and undeniable royalty. I stepped in right beside him, wearing a dark velvet dress lined with expensive silver wool fur. My hand rested comfortably in Tristan's, our fingers intertwined to naturally display our unbreakable mate bond. Ethan flinched at the sudden sight of us, pulling weakly against his heavy, unforgiving chains. He looked at my face, searching desperately for a single ounce of the blind devotion I used to give him. He found only a cold, beautiful, and completely terrifying void. "You came down here just to gloat," Ethan croaked, his voice raw from screaming during his humiliating defeat in the courtyard. "I came down here to deliver a final message," I replied smoothly, my voice echoing off the cold stone walls. Tristan raised his free hand, and a shadow-cloaked guard immediately placed a thick stack of parchment into my grasp. I held up the heavy documents, letting the golden wax seals of the Southern Alliance catch the dim, flickering torchlight. "These are the new trade agreements signed at dawn by every single merchant who used to fund your dying pack," I stated clearly. Ethan's bloodshot eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as he recognized his former allies' royal crests. "Your vital rivers are completely frozen, your mountain passes are heavily blocked, and your treasury is entirely empty." I let the heavy parchment drop to the wet stone floor right in front of his ruined leather boots. "You did not just lose a simple military skirmish tonight, Ethan. You have officially lost your alpha title, your ancestral lands, and your entire bloodline's legacy." Ethan let out a strangled, pathetic sob, his bruised knees giving out as he hung limply from the iron restraints. "Vivian, please listen to me," he begged, warm tears finally spilling down his dirt-streaked face. "I was manipulated by Blair and her father's toxic promises of absolute power. I never actually wanted to hurt you, you have to believe that I was just blinded by ambition." Tristan let out a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through the very foundation of the ancient stone keep. His stormy grey eyes flashed with the terrifying golden light of a fully dominant, thoroughly enraged alpha wolf. "You struck my destined mate in front of 300 watching witnesses," Tristan's voice was pure, lethal silk. "You do not get to blame another woman for the pathetic weakness rotting inside your own soul." Tristan pulled me gently against his broad chest, wrapping his strong arm protectively around my waist. He leaned down and pressed his warm lips to the sensitive curve of my neck, right over my racing pulse point. The electric shock of his intimate touch sent a visible shiver down my spine, a pure display of our primal connection. Ethan watched the possessive gesture, and a gut-wrenching wail of sheer emotional agony tore from his throat. He finally understood that I was not just a political ally standing with his greatest, most feared rival. I belonged to Tristan in body, mind, and soul, elevated to a magnificent height Ethan could never possibly reach. We turned away from his pitiful crying and walked out of the freezing cell without uttering another word. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind us, permanently sealing his psychological tomb. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the luxurious Southern Alliance stronghold, sheer panic was spreading like wildfire. Blair paced frantically across the polished marble floor of her extravagantly decorated bedchamber. A blood-stained messenger raven had arrived barely an hour ago with the devastating news of the Northern massacre. Her golden ticket to becoming a ruling alpha queen had just been slaughtered brutally in the snow. She frantically shoved her heavy diamond necklaces and priceless emerald rings into a leather travel bag. She desperately needed to escape to the eastern ports before the Midnight Ridge army marched south to claim their bloody vengeance. Suddenly, the gilded wooden doors of her chamber burst open, splintering violently off their expensive brass hinges. Her father, the supposedly invincible lord of the southern rivers, marched in with a face as pale as death. 2 heavily armored royal guards flanked him, their sharp swords already drawn and gleaming with lethal intent. "Father, we must leave this fortress instantly," Blair shrieked, dropping her heavy bag of stolen jewels. "Tristan and that wretched orphan are going to march down here and slaughter us all." Her father did not offer her a comforting embrace or a fatherly promise of safety. Instead, he stepped forward and struck her viciously across the face with the back of his heavy, ringed hand. The sharp sound was a terrifying, poetic echo of the very slap Ethan had given me just a few days ago. Blair collapsed onto the cold marble floor, tasting her own warm blood, looking up at her father in pure shock. "You foolish, impossibly arrogant little girl," her father hissed, his voice trembling with absolute terror. "You convinced Ethan to publicly insult the sovereign's chosen mate, and now you have doomed our entire family to the slaughterhouse." He signaled sharply to the armored guards, who stepped forward and grabbed Blair roughly by her trembling arms. "Lock her in the highest stone tower and prepare the reinforced carriage immediately," her father ordered coldly. "We are riding north at first light to offer our unconditional and absolute surrender. And we are bringing her in iron chains as a peace offering to the new queen of the Midnight Ridge." Blair screamed frantically and thrashed against the strong guards, but her pathetic cries went entirely ignored. The very people she thought she controlled were now eagerly throwing her to the wolves just to save themselves. Back at the impregnable Midnight Ridge, the morning sun finally broke over the jagged black peaks, bathing the fortress in golden light. I stood on the highest stone balcony, wearing my mother's glowing emerald and a stunning crown woven from dark iron. The freezing air bit at my exposed skin, but Tristan's radiating body heat kept me perfectly warm. He stood right behind me, resting his chin softly on the top of my head, breathing in the fresh scent of my hair. I looked down at the massive, terrifying army assembling flawlessly in the vast courtyard below. Their polished steel armor shone brilliantly in the sun, and their spears pointed proudly toward the sky. They were no longer just Tristan's legendary soldiers, they were my deeply loyal, fiercely protective pack. The most dangerous Alpha King had willingly shared his dark throne, and the entire Northern Hemisphere was about to bow. Every single step of my journey had been forged in unexpected pain, but the final destination was pure, unadulterated power. The political game of thrones played within the werewolf kingdoms was entirely ruthless and unforgiving. But my enemies were about to learn that a resurrected, unbroken wolf is the most dangerous predator in the forest. And my fangs were finally bared for the entire world to see. The massive iron gates of the Midnight Ridge fortress groaned open to welcome the broken remnants of the Southern Alliance. The freezing northern wind howled mercilessly, whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy across the grand exterior courtyard. Inside the great stone hall, however, the air was suffocatingly hot and thick with the primal scent of burning pine. I sat upon a towering throne carved from a single block of polished obsidian, draped in luxurious, midnight blue wolf pelts. Tristan sat right beside me on an identical throne, his muscular frame radiating a terrifying and absolute alpha dominance. Our hands were clasped firmly together on the wide stone armrest, the visible mate bond sending silent ripples of pure energy through the room. Hundreds of elite northern generals and heavily scarred pack warriors lined the towering walls, their expressions unreadable and deeply intimidating. The pale winter sunlight pierced through the high stained glass windows, casting sharp, cinematic beams across the dark stone floor. They were waiting in total silence for the promised spectacle of absolute southern surrender. The thick oak doors at the far end of the hall were pushed open with an echoing, definitive thud. Lord Harrington, the supposedly invincible ruler of the southern rivers, walked into the room with his head bowed deeply in sheer humiliation. He was stripped of his usual golden silks and burdensome jeweled crowns, wearing nothing but a plain, rough grey woolen tunic. His hands were completely empty, having surrendered all his ancestral weapons at the heavily guarded border of our impregnable territory. Behind him, dragged aggressively by two towering northern guards, was Blair. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, glowing noblewoman who had sneered at me just a few days ago during the winter solstice festival. Her pristine white gowns were torn, filthy, and heavily stained with the freezing mud of the long, unforgiving northern road. Cold iron shackles bound her delicate wrists, the metal clinking pitifully loudly against the hard stone floor with every dragging step. Her golden hair was a tangled, greasy mess, hiding a face swollen and bruised from her own father's desperate, terrified violence. The vast assembly of northern warriors remained deadly silent, watching the pathetic procession with cold, hyperrealistic predatory eyes. Lord Harrington stopped exactly 10 paces from the obsidian thrones and immediately dropped heavily to his knees. The loud, painful crack of his kneecaps hitting the stone floor echoed sharply in the cavernous, quiet hall. Blair was violently forced to her knees right beside him, her entire body trembling violently from both the freezing cold and pure psychological terror. "Sovereign Tristan," Lord Harrington began, his voice shaking pathetically as he kept his tear-filled eyes glued strictly to the floor. "And Queen Vivian, the undisputed lady of the Midnight Ridge." Hearing my own name followed by that ultimate title from the mouth of my former oppressor sent a thrilling rush of pure ice through my veins. Tristan did not speak a single word, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the kneeling lord with the cold indifference of a god judging a dying insect. He simply squeezed my hand, non-verbally passing the absolute authority of the executioner entirely to me. I leaned forward slightly, feeling the cool weight of the iron and emerald crown resting perfectly upon my braided hair. "You have travelled a very long way from your warm, comfortable rivers, Lord Harrington," I said, my voice echoing smoothly and flawlessly through the massive hall. "I deeply trust the northern roads were not too unforgiving for your delicate southern horses." Lord Harrington flinched violently at the subtle, razor-sharp mockery woven seamlessly into my calm words. "We come to offer our absolute and unconditional surrender to the Midnight Ridge," he rushed out, desperately eager to appease the wolves. "We have brought the traitor who poisoned the mind of Chieftain Ethan and foolishly broke the sacred winter truce." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at his own weeping, broken daughter. Blair let out a muffled, agonizing sob, lifting her tear-streaked face to look directly into my eyes. The vicious, triumphant gleam in her expression was completely gone, replaced entirely by the hollow, vacant stare of a trapped animal. "Vivian, please," Blair choked out, the unforgiving iron chains rattling as she tried to raise her hands in a desperate begging gesture. "I was foolish, I was deeply jealous. I didn't know he would strike you, I swear to the goddess I didn't know." I looked down at her, feeling an immense, terrifying wave of absolute calm wash completely over my soul. "You knew exactly what you were doing the moment you stepped into my former home, Blair," I replied, my tone dangerously quiet and utterly devoid of mercy. You wanted my ring, you wanted my title, and you wanted my entire life. I stood up slowly, the thick midnight blue cloak sweeping majestically across the raised obsidian dais. But you tragically failed to realize that stealing a crown does not automatically grant you the strength required to wear it. I walked gracefully down the stone steps, stopping just a few feet away from the trembling southern lord and his utterly disgraced daughter. The entire hall held its collective breath, the tension so thick it could be cut with a silver blade. Your southern rivers are completely useless without the iron protection of the northern mountain packs, I declared loudly, addressing the entire room. And starting exactly today, the Southern Alliance is entirely and permanently dissolved. Lord Harrington gasped loudly, his face turning an impossible shade of sickly, terrifying pale. My queen, please, our innocent people will freeze, our loyal merchants will starve, he begged frantically, bowing until his forehead touched my boots. Your people will survive under the direct, absolute administration of the Midnight Ridge, I corrected him with frigid authority. You, however, will spend the rest of your miserable life working in the deep, lightless iron mines of the eastern border. Lord Harrington collapsed fully onto the stone floor, weeping openly as the hulking northern guards stepped forward to drag him roughly away. Blair watched her father being hauled out of the grand room, her eyes wide with a soul-crushing, absolute terror. She looked back up at me, the devastating realization hitting her that she was now entirely alone in the very heart of the wolf's den. And what exactly are you going to do with me? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling roar of the hearth fire. I looked at the foolish girl who had tried to build her happily ever after on the burning ashes of my personal dignity. You are going to be escorted directly to the freezing subterranean dungeons right below this very hall, I said with a terrifyingly serene smile. You will be securely locked in the heavy iron cell placed directly across from Ethan. Blair's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror at the mere mention of the ruined, violently mad chieftain. You will spend the rest of your pathetic days looking at the desperately weak man whose ambition destroyed your entire noble family. And he will spend his days looking through the iron bars at the woman who cost him his absolute northern empire. You two can viciously blame each other in the dark until the absolute end of time. Blair began to scream, a shrill, ear-piercing sound of total psychological annihilation. She thrashed wildly against the heavy chains as the guards grabbed her arms and dragged her roughly toward the dark, spiraling stone staircase. Her desperate screams echoed through the great hall until the heavy iron dungeon doors slammed shut, cutting off the miserable sound completely. The massive room descended back into a state of perfect, highly disciplined silence. I turned around and walked slowly back up the dark obsidian steps toward my patiently waiting mate. Tristan stood up to meet me, his stormy grey eyes blazing with a dark, overwhelming, and deeply possessive pride. He reached out and pulled me flush against his hard, heavily muscled chest, wrapping his arms around me for the entire pack to witness. The entire continent is now yours, my brilliant, beautiful queen, Tristan murmured softly against the sensitive skin of my neck. The exhausting political war was completely over, the pathetic traitors were buried in the dark, and the golden era of the Midnight Ridge had officially begun. The ancient cavern beneath the impregnable Midnight Ridge was illuminated entirely by the ethereal glow of thousands of floating crystalline candles. This was the sacred lunar spring, a hidden subterranean sanctuary where only the true rulers of the north were ever permitted to tread. The heavy air was thick with the intoxicating scent of crushed winter blooms and the warm, magical steam rising off the sapphire-blue thermal pools. Tonight was not just a simple political coronation to cement my absolute authority over the newly conquered territories. It was the profoundly sacred marking ceremony that would irreversibly bind my soul to Tristan for the rest of eternity. I stood in the opulent dressing chamber as four elderly pack matrons carefully draped the heavy ceremonial garments over my shivering shoulders. The breathtaking gown was an absolute masterpiece woven from pure silver thread and the rarest, most expensive midnight blue silk in the world. It clung to my curves with devastating elegance, leaving my neck and collarbone entirely bare for the ancient, bloody ritual to come. My mother's glowing emerald rested proudly against my chest, a beautiful, undeniable reminder of the noble lineage Ethan had so foolishly tried to erase. The heavy iron and silver crown was placed gently upon my intricately braided hair, anchoring me permanently to my magnificent new destiny. When the massive stone doors of the chamber finally opened, the deafening silence of the waiting pack washed over me like a physical, terrifying wave. Thousands of elite warriors, seasoned generals, and fully subdued southern lords lined the spiraling obsidian staircase that led down to the glowing water. They did not dare to cheer, nor did they even whisper, out of absolute reverence for the sacred, ancient magic about to unfold. I began my slow descent, my bare feet touching the warm, ancient stone steps with absolute, unwavering confidence. With every single step I took, the gathered wolves bowed their heads in deep, instinctual submission to their true, undisputed queen. At the very bottom of the grand staircase, standing patiently at the edge of the glowing blue water, was my destined mate. Tristan looked like a terrifying, magnificent northern god who had descended straight from the most violent ancient myths. He was entirely stripped of his heavy steel armor and royal winter cloaks, wearing only loose, dark linen trousers that rode low on his heavily muscled hips. His broad, deeply scarred chest rose and fell with a heavy, primal rhythm as he watched me approach the edge of the sacred pool. The stormy grey of his eyes had completely vanished, replaced by the blazing, luminous gold of a fully awakened, fiercely dominant alpha wolf. His raw, unadulterated power radiated through the damp cavern, pressing aggressively against my skin like a suffocating, deeply intoxicating heat. I stopped exactly one step above him, looking fearlessly down into the fiercely possessive eyes of the most dangerous man on the entire continent. "You came to me as a broken, bleeding exile in the dead of winter," Tristan murmured, his deep, gravelly voice echoing beautifully across the silent, glassy water. "And today, you stand before me as the absolute, undisputed heart of my entire northern empire." He extended his large, heavily calloused hand toward me, his strong fingers trembling ever so slightly with sheer, untamed anticipation. I placed my hand firmly in his, feeling the familiar, violent electric jolt of our undeniable mate bond surge instantly up my arm. "I came to you merely seeking a simple tactical alliance for revenge," I answered smoothly, my voice ringing out perfectly clear and perfectly steady. "But I unexpectedly found the only soul in this world strong enough to hold my fire without burning away into ashes." Tristan pulled me gently down the final stone step, his incredibly strong hands sliding flawlessly around my narrow waist. He lifted me effortlessly into the air, carrying me slowly and reverently into the shallow, perfectly warm waters of the glowing sapphire spring. The magical blue water swirled elegantly around my calves, completely soaking the heavy silver hem of my gown, but I absolutely did not care. We stopped in the exact center of the sacred pool, directly beneath the massive circular skylight that revealed the brilliant, unclouded full moon. The bright silver moonlight cascaded down like a divine spotlight, perfectly illuminating the flawless, unblemished skin of my totally exposed neck. Tristan reached up slowly, his rough thumbs gently tracing the sharp line of my jaw with a devastating, heartbreakingly soft tenderness. "I claim you not as a conquered possession, but as my perfect, fiercely brilliant equal," he vowed loudly, ensuring every single wolf in the massive cavern heard his absolute truth. "My invincible armies are your armies, my vast territory is your territory, and my very life is entirely yours to command until my final breath." I looked up at the magnificent night sky, letting out a soft, breathless sigh of pure, untainted, and deeply emotional surrender. "And I completely accept you, Tristan of the Midnight Ridge, as my true destined mate, my alpha, and my eternal, undisputed king." The exact moment the final vow left my trembling lips, the primal, deeply ancient instinct of the wolf took complete and absolute control over him. Tristan let out a low, terrifyingly possessive growl that vibrated powerfully against my chest and sent shivers down the spines of the watching audience. He dipped his head gracefully, his exceptionally hot breath ghosting tantalizingly over the wildly beating pulse point on the side of my neck. I closed my eyes tightly and tilted my head back, willingly offering him the ultimate, irreversible access to my very soul and my physical being. His remarkably sharp, elongated fangs pierced the delicate skin of my neck with a sudden, brilliant flash of intensely sharp pain. But the sharp pain lasted only a microscopic fraction of a second before it violently exploded into a rushing, terrifying wave of absolute euphoria. The intense, blinding heat of his alpha venom mixed seamlessly with my blood, forging an unbreakable, magical, and eternal chain directly between our spirits. I gasped loudly into the quiet cavern, gripping his broad, incredibly muscular shoulders as the sheer magnitude of the completed mate bond flooded my entire nervous system. I could suddenly feel the rhythmic thud of his strong heartbeat echoing perfectly in sync with my own racing pulse. I could intimately feel his overwhelming protective instincts, his absolute, unshakable devotion, and his terrifying capacity for limitless violence. When he finally, reluctantly pulled his fangs back, a faintly glowing, silver crescent moon mark was permanently burned into the tender skin of my neck. Tristan looked intensely at the freshly claimed mark, his glowing golden eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful mixture of dark triumph and profound, absolute worship. He leaned down and gently licked the single, crimson drop of blood trailing down my pale collarbone, sealing the sacred, ancient ritual completely. A deafening, totally earth-shattering roar simultaneously erupted from the thousands of hardened wolves watching closely from the cavern stairs. They threw their heads back and howled furiously at the open skylight, their powerful voices blending into a terrifying, beautiful symphony of absolute loyalty. The incredible, unified sound literally shook the very ancient stone foundations of the mountain, broadcasting a clear, undeniable warning to the rest of the frightened world. I turned slowly within Tristan's protective arms, finally facing the massive, kneeling crowd of elite warriors and utterly subdued lords. I was no longer just Vivian, the discarded, publicly humiliated orphan of the pitifully weak Crestwood pack. I was the supreme, permanently marked queen of the Midnight Ridge, possessing a terrifying love and a vast empire that absolutely no earthly force could ever destroy. Tristan wrapped his heavy, incredibly warm bear fur cloak around my shivering, soaked body, holding me incredibly tight against his rapidly beating chest. The exhausting political war was completely won, the arrogant enemies were rotting forever in the dark, and my glorious, absolute reign had finally, truly begun. 5 harsh northern winters have passed since the sacred waters of the lunar spring bore witness to our eternal bond. The once isolated fortress of the Midnight Ridge has expanded into a sprawling, impenetrable metropolis of dark stone and shining steel. A magnificent golden era has fully blossomed under the unified banner of the silver crescent moon. The previously fractured territories now operate with the flawless, synchronized precision of a legendary war machine. Prosperity flows freely through the newly forged mountain passes, completely ignoring the bitter cold of the deep frost. Caravans heavily laden with southern silk and eastern grain arrive daily, paying absolute homage to the undisputed crown. I stand on the highest balcony of the sovereign keep, letting the crisp, biting wind trace the contours of my face. The heavy, midnight blue velvet of my gown ripples gracefully, carrying the clean scent of pine and fresh snow. The exquisite silver crown rests comfortably upon my brow, a permanent testament to the power I seized from the ashes of betrayal. My mother's ancient emerald glows warmly against my collarbone, pulsing softly with the heartbeat of a resurrected bloodline. Below me, the massive courtyard is a vibrant mosaic of deeply loyal pack members and thriving, fully protected merchants. Laughter and music drift upward, completely replacing the terrified silence that once defined the brutal northern winters. I watch a group of young, spirited wolves training in the snowy arena, their movements sharp and full of untamed promise. They fight not out of desperate survival, but out of profound pride for the magnificent empire we have meticulously built. A familiar, radiating heat approaches from behind, instantly chasing away the lingering chill of the mountain air. Tristan wraps his incredibly muscular arms around my waist, pulling my back flush against his broad, immovable chest. His deeply masculine scent anchors my soaring thoughts, instantly grounding me in the beautiful reality of our shared existence. He rests his chin upon my shoulder, his stormy grey eyes tracking the exact same vibrant scene unfolding below us. The devastatingly sharp fangs that once pierced my neck now graze softly against my skin in a gesture of profound, quiet worship. Our mate bond thrums beneath the surface of my pulse, a silent, indestructible current of pure, unadulterated devotion. We do not need to speak to understand the sheer magnitude of the legacy we have forged completely from scratch. We are the living, breathing embodiment of absolute strength, successfully forged in the fires of unforgivable treachery. However, the foundation of this breathtaking paradise is firmly planted above a forgotten, suffocating, and miserable abyss. Far beneath the joyous celebrations and the gleaming obsidian towers lies the darkest, coldest sector of our subterranean dungeons. It is a place entirely devoid of natural light, where hope is systematically starved and sanity slowly rots away into nothing. Inside the deepest, heaviest iron cell, a hollow, wretched shell of a man huddles pathetically in the damp corner. Ethan is completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, shining chieftain who once demanded my absolute obedience in the great hall. His once handsome face is deeply hollowed, framed by a matted, filthy tangle of heavily grey-streaked hair. The expensive ceremonial silver armor of his past has been permanently replaced by ragged, lice-infested wool. He violently scratches at the unforgiving stone floor, his broken fingernails bleeding as he mutters incoherent, desperate apologies to invisible ghosts. Directly across the narrow, freezing corridor, securely locked behind perfectly identical iron bars, sits his eternal tormentor. Blair is a withered, horrifying shadow of the radiant southern noblewoman who had eagerly conspired to steal my entire life. Her golden hair has entirely fallen out in jagged patches, revealing a scalp heavily scarred by her own frantic, maddened scratching. Her throat is raw and permanently ruined from 5 relentless years of screaming toxic, venomous curses into the suffocating dark. Every single day, she drags her heavy iron chains to the front of her cell just to spit pure hatred at the man who ruined her golden future. And every single day, Ethan violently throws himself against the iron bars, weeping hysterically while blaming her for his total annihilation. They are permanently trapped in a perfectly designed, inescapable purgatory of their own magnificent making. They possess absolutely nothing but the crushing, suffocating memory of the exact moment they foolishly underestimated a broken woman. Their agonizing screams never reach the surface of the mountain, entirely swallowed by the unforgiving, heavy northern stone. I close my eyes briefly, letting the phantom echo of Ethan's fatal, arrogant slap fade permanently into the absolute void. The helpless girl who stood weeping silently in the great stone hall all those years ago is dead and buried deeply beneath the snow. She was violently dismantled by the blind ambition of weak men, only to be entirely resurrected by a king who truly understood her supreme worth. I open my eyes and turn slightly, capturing Tristan's lips in a slow, deeply consuming kiss that tastes of absolute, final victory. The entire continent bows deeply to the sovereign of the Midnight Ridge and his fiercely brilliant, permanently marked queen. Our reign is not merely a fleeting, quickly forgotten chapter in the bloody history of the werewolf kingdoms. It is an eternal, unshakable dynasty strictly built upon the beautiful, brutal truth that a discarded diamond will eventually cut glass. The winter winds howl fiercely across the jagged peaks, carrying the terrifying, magnificent legend of our ultimate triumph to the edges of the earth. We own the dark night, we command the bright dawn, and the Iron Throne is forever ours.